Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the afternoon segment of our talks today for the open house for the launch of the International Photography Exhibition, now in its 164th year. I'd like to introduce you to Michelle Sank. Michelle was born in South Africa and settled in the UK in 1987. She cites this background as informing her interest in subcultures and contemporary social issues, which she explores in her portraiture. Images from her series Drag Daughters are in the show in this year's IPE, documenting the strong drag culture in the communities of townships in Cape Town. Thank you.
Today, as Freddie mentioned, I'll just talk a little bit about my background for how it's kind of shaped my photographic eye, both through the subject matter I choose to document, but also the photographic elements I deploy and the link to the work from my series Drag Daughters that's showing in the current exhibition that I made last year in South Africa when I was there. I was born and brought up in South Africa to a Jewish immigrant family, and I lived through the apartheid era. And I think it's this overriding marginalization that has drawn me to document subcultures or those people who live on the edge of society. South Africa, as I'm sure all of you know, is a country that is rich in its dramatic light, its space, its strong color, and its space, but also the diversity of cultures and religions, which each have their own festivities and pageants that manifest through ritual and dress. And it's this presentation of identity through costume, materiality, and performance that has so interested me over my career. It's these elements that subconsciously, as a very young student in South Africa, I was starting to engage with, as evident in this image. This was one of the very first portraits I made on the promenade in Cape Town where I grew up. And what's interesting for me is the fact that the promenade was the springboard for the work that's upstairs, which I'll talk about later. But this was a series that I did on aged Jewish immigrants, Russian immigrants that had come to South Africa. And it was really the beginning of me focusing in on that kind of richness of dress and culture and the way elements can build up a narrative. So the brooch, the pearls, the fur of her hat, the way the light is hitting that. And the modernity of the buildings behind that subtle narrative of old and new, and the mystery of behind the glasses, that life that they'd been through to get here. I had a huge gap in my career, over 20 years in leaving South Africa. And when I finally settled in the UK in 1987 and was able to resume my career, I did a part-time master's in Leeds. And it was these elements from my heritage that I was really searching for in the UK when I started to make work. And it was in my projects with adolescents that I guess has become the hallmark of my photographic practice. I found it in these young people, both in their kind of transition between childhood and adulthood, but also in their clothing, the exoticness of their clothing, their individuality, the exploration of identity, body image, gesture. There's a book outside that was my first monograph of a whole series of projects I did around my youth work. But what was written in the book, and I'll just read it to you, it is as if the subject experiences the space of the portrait as a conventional studio or a stage, with its accompanying dramatic potential. It is if, in framing the subject, the photographer constructs a view of the space in a similar way as a space of performance. So I think there's a dual thing going on between performance in me and performance with the subject. And I'm just going to go through just some of the images that illustrate this. So that's one of the very first images I took when I was doing my master's, and I tended to go to spaces that drew me, which had familiarity to me, where I grew up in Cape Town, which was the seaside. So I would literally just walk the promenade. And if I saw something, I was quite shy at that stage, but I did walk past her and then went back and photographed her. And it's just this wonderful celebration of this clothing, this gesture, the strange kind of fantasy thing that's going on in the background, the clouds, and how this narrative about growing up and this individuality and body image and presentation of identity is being explored. So that's someone else I ran after in the street at a festival in Weymouth, and there was just something really extraordinary about his presentation of self, the sensuality of his body, the representation of masculinity but vulnerability at the same time, the tattoos, which all have resonance for me from my background. Another example, this is on the cover of the book that's outside, someone I found in the street in Exeter, this wonderful gold coat and this real mixture of adulthood and childhood and presentation of a kind of pre-sexuality. This was a project called Bye Bye Baby, and I was really concerned, I mean, this is in the early 2000s, with the pre-adultization of young people before it was so much in the media. And of course, the way color and light are working together, which was so reminiscent of my upbringing in South Africa, the way light can really charge color. And for me, this is not a calm image. It's really quite charged psychologically. This is someone else I stopped in the street in London. And once again, the same thing about this subtle tension between young and old and the clothing and cultural coding and presentation. I'm just going to move through it. There's a lot of work I did. I had a commission with Belfast Exposed, where they wanted me to work with both Protestant and Catholic youth across the divide. But once again, it's this costume. It's the little things like the pendant, her repose, the kind of religious spiritual element that's coming through in this, and the way the subject and background set up nuances and narratives. That's another example of some street work that I did in Belfast Exposed. So I'm very drawn towards this pageantry, and as I say, the representation of cultural coding through the way people present themselves. Once again, a young stripper that I found in the street as well. So a lot of my early work was street work. I then went on to get residencies and commissions where I was given people to work with, but accompanying that, they would want me to go out into the street. I then had a commission with Wolverhampton Museum and Art Gallery to work with the Muslim and Sikh culture. So the thread continues with this thing of costume and pageantry, I guess. Yes. And then I was getting a lot of sort of commissions and residencies with galleries, both here and in Europe and abroad. And I then had this wonderful residency in Wales, where I was given a studio for 3 months, and I could do whatever I liked, actually. So I went out every day and started to play again. But the reason for showing you this is the sense, once again, of these rituals and performance and costume within the landscape that I'm constantly drawn towards. So this was in a dance hall, these wonderful women who were partners. But, you know, for me, I'm very drawn to almost like the jewel-like quality of the way these people present themselves, you know, their shoes, the sparkling, the dress. Once again, this was extraordinary because she had known my work in Wolverhampton, and I just happened to find her on the beach in Aberystwyth. So it was this wonderful, wonderful circle. Once again, this pageantry, this was a guy dressed up as a woman for a festival. And then just to show you some of the work, I also do internal portraits where I'm really interested in the way, the context of the work as opposed to outside, but how what's inside becomes a metaphor for people's lives or their personalities. So Multi-Story in West Bromwich in 2018 commissioned me to make work around the diversity of young people in the Black country and their aspirations for growing up in what is essentially quite a deprived area. So this is also became a book with interviews of the young people. But what I really loved was, for example, this was traditional bridal dress, and then the subtle westernization that's coming in with the little keyring on the door. So this, they were recent immigrants to the Black country. So I'm really interested in those subtle pointers. Some more, I've forgotten what the name of this cult, but it's a very, very British, that I'm sorry, I can't remember it. But once again, in his bedroom, she was an Irish dancer, so I just loved, the leopard skin on her bedspread, the elephant on the phone, it was just the fluffy cushion, all these tiny little elements that build up a narrative about the person that I'm working with. This was his room, which was extraordinary because it's like an adult in a child's bedroom, but he was studying dance. So you can see the thread going through, and it's interesting, when I was preparing this talk, I began to really understand my own work in terms of my being drawn to this kind of costume and ritual and pageantry. Wonderful, wonderful experience I had with him. I photographed him in the studio, which didn't work for me. So I asked if I could come to his house, and he arrived in this full rabbit onesie at the door. And I think he thought I would be a bit shocked. And I said, God, this is amazing. So we went into his band, just, the thing of Love Me, that wonderful presentation of the body, the hunter shoes, it's magical when it sort of comes together. And then it's just leading on to the work that's upstairs. But, in 2012, I became, my interest in body image and young people did a kind of circle, and I became interested in young people under the age of 25 in the UK who were doing, having cosmetic surgery, Botox and so on at a very young age. So I started this project. This is Hannah. She was 15 when I photographed her having had Botox. But once again, the bedroom becoming this really important context for the work. And then it just led me on to working with people who were transitioning. And so this was Jackie, who was the first young person in the UK to have full transition surgery. And she had it done in America because at that stage she couldn't have it in the UK. And her mother was one of the founders of the Mermaid organization. So this was an extraordinary journey for me, and one person led me onto another person. This was Campbell, who was 15, who I photographed was where my first work I did as a student in South Africa. And I walked along and I found Jermaine. And I said to him, Jermaine, I've just landed from England and I'm a photographer and could I photograph you? He said, but of course you can. And he said, I've just been crowned Miss Drag South Africa. I said, you have? And he said, yes. And I said, well, would you mind if I met you and worked with you? And he said, no, that's fine. And I thought, this is never, ever going to happen. It's never going to happen. Anyway, we exchanged numbers and we met. And he was staying at a hotel at the end of the beach, quite a sort of glamorous hotel. So I went there and I was telling Freddie earlier, I arrived at reception and I said, I'm here to photograph Jermaine. They said, oh my God, you're the photographer, just go up to room 402. And I went up and it was just spectacular. So that was Jermaine in the hotel room. So I spent a couple of hours with him and he didn't have a lot of stuff with him, but he did have his drag sash. So we spent a couple of hours working with one another, which was amazing. And just going back to the previous image, South Africa has a very, very rich drag history, particularly Cape Town, which is known as the drag capital of South Africa. And the birth of drag there can be traced back to the 1950s, when underground gay pageants emerged in parts of South Africa, safe spaces for LGBT people during apartheid, when homosexuality was still punishable by law. So underground parties in Cape Town became a safe place for people to be in drag, and it continues to be considered as an art form and an expression of affirmation and a symbol of solidarity. This is an image of Kupi, who's known as the daughter of District 6, who was born in 1941 and identified as gender fluid. There's currently an archive and exhibition of the photographs of her within the community at the District 6 Museum in Cape Town. And this is a quote from theirs. They show a community and culture where gender non-conforming people who often face prejudice and exclusion in contemporary South Africa were largely accepted and loved as human beings with the right to express themselves as they wished. The struggle for LGBTQ rights continues, and Kupi's story helps to show the way forward. So there's this most wonderful supportive community in Cape Town. And what happened is that Jermaine then led me on to try and meet other young people doing drag. And Eddie was another extraordinary thing. So, every day I was going out to the promenade. I've made another body of work, which is not to do with this. And I saw this guy who was dressed really very flamboyantly. So I went up to him and I said, you don't do drag by any chance? And he said, well, I used to. So I said, well, do you think you might work with me? He said, sure. So I was going to go to his place. And then he texted me, he said, I'll come to you. And I thought, great, I'll just use the hotel. I really liked the glamour of the hotel, the kind of setting of the hotel, the way the glamour of them merged with that. So I just went to the hotel and I said, I was here like last week, but would you mind if I just moved the furniture around and I'll put everything back? And they were so kind of fascinated. So I basically took over the hotel so this is Eddie. So they would come and they changed the hotel, and then like the security guy just was completely fascinated. So this is Eddie. And then I found Belinda, who's a school teacher in one of the townships, and he came through again to the hotel. And, obviously I was navigating all different spaces in the hotel. So I had to sort of constantly move furniture and move people. And, I feel only in South Africa could I do this. I mean, it was a major hotel, but they were so warm and I think wonderful about it that it became my space. So that's on Sharpstairs, and that's Lila, and he's extraordinary. And he was ostracized by his family. He lived in quite a remote part of South Africa and ended up living on a train and was homeless, and then got into drag, was supported by the community, and has now a very prominent role in supporting other young people and setting up the Lila Foundation. And that was in the reception of the hotel. So, and I go back to South Africa tomorrow morning. So what started as, you know, I wasn't even meant to be in South Africa for so long last year. I'm now going there to continue. And the other images, I was telling Freddie earlier, I met this wonderful woman, Maxine, and I went to her house in this area outside of Cape Town, and I worked with him. And then there was this just amazing young guy walking around the house, and I said, "Who's that?" And she said, "He's my drag daughter." And that's where the name of this project came. So he lives with her, and he's teaching him how to do drag, and so they perform together. And yeah, so that's the end of the talk.
Do we have any questions? Yes.
Obviously, you've photographed a lot of different subcultures, and many of them are not ones that you come from. If you have relations to, say, the drags or the drag queens or Muslim groups.
No, I don't come from, you know, but because of my growing up in South Africa and being surrounded by that and immersed in that, I have a real affinity for that.
Yes, I was wondering, do you do any kind of formal research before, or is it something that's more natural?
Well, this happened quite naturally, you know, but I have obviously researched that now, and I will be going to the District 6 Museum when I go to Cape Town. And yes, I do. So this thing around young people, you know, I did a lot of reading into gender and presentation of gender. And then obviously, you know, I had a lot of commissions and residencies over the years. So I would do research around that, around, you know, when, say for Wolverhampton, you know, how that population emerged, you know, so yeah. Yeah.
Michelle, I just wanted, obviously, lots of photographers, lots of us photographers, especially of the male community, we sometimes worry about photographing youngsters,
yes,
especially under 18, particularly that age. What do you do regarding permissions and so on?
I carry a book around with me. So if the parents aren't with the child, which I don't do very often before. Earlier I did when it wasn't, you know, this hype, but now I do. And I make sure that everyone gets a photograph and that I get a model release for that. So even the work that I did in South Africa, everyone got contacted. Yeah.
Sure. So everyone signs a model release, all their parents, their guardians.
If they're under 18 or under 16, yeah. And in fact, you know, when I did work in Germany, I had a commission there. They refused to show the work unless I had a model release. So it was extraordinary, because how I did this project, I don't know, because I was speaking, you know, I didn't speak German, but I then had an assistant come with me to everyone's house, which was fascinating, and got the model releases for that. Yeah.
Michelle, I think your portraits are outstanding, and I say that as someone who battles with the same things as you, and I know how difficult it is to do this. I really think you capture people's power, and you put that, you just really bring it out of them. I was wondering, have you ever considered maybe doing groups of them together? Because that would even amplify that.
Yeah, and in fact, the work that I'm not showing here, but other work that I've done, that I did last year in South Africa on the promenade, there are quite a lot of group portraits, and some of the recent work that I've been doing on promenades where I live, because I'm trying to sort of link the two, is more group, but certainly with these it would be interesting, and hopefully that's something that can develop when I'm God knows what's going to happen when I'm there now.
I would love to see that. I would love it.
Be amazing.
Any other questions? Yes.
A question from the live stream from Megan asking, how do you source and approach your subjects?
When it's not commissioned work, I work on the street. So basically I just go up to people, which takes a lot of courage. And even after all these years, I still, you know, but it's just the most, I just go up and speak to people. And I think that if you approach people with respect and dignity, it's reciprocal, and I just have the most wonderful time meeting people on the street. And sometimes the interaction continues, sometimes it's only for the time that I photograph, but it's such a human experience for me that yeah, it's very life affirming. Crazy, but
So we've now got a second question coming from the live stream from Leslie asking, firstly saying how interesting the talk was, and then wanted to ask, how long do you spend with your subject? Do you like to build a rapport, for instance?
well, when I'm doing more constructed, you know, when I'm in a so say the work for multi-story, I had more time to spend in the room to establish a relationship. Like here, when I'm on the street, it can be 20 minutes, it can continue if we start talking. So it depends on the situation. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle. That was a wonderful talk. Thank you.